My name is Willow. And on the day of my wedding, standing at the altar in my dress, the entire room burst out laughing at me. Not a little giggle, not an awkward chuckle. A real, loud, cruel laugh. The kind that fills a room and bounces off the walls and goes straight into your chest. And my husband-to-be, the man I had loved for 2 years, the man I had trusted with everything I had. He looked right past me and smiled at her. Now most people in that moment would have cried, some would have run, some would have frozen completely. But I didn't do any of those things. Because 3 days before that wedding, I found out exactly what was waiting for me at that altar. And I didn't cancel. I came prepared. What happened next in that church, in front of all those laughing faces? Nobody saw it coming. Not Diane, not Serena, not Carter. And especially not that room. Stay with me, because this story is not about heartbreak. This story is about what happens when the wrong woman is pushed too far. Before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome to Willow. Every week I sit down and share a story, real, raw, and unfiltered. Stories about women who were underestimated, women who were humiliated, women who were counted out. And what they did about it. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the ending of this story is going to stay with you for a long time, and you do not want to miss what comes next on this channel. Now, let's go back to the beginning. I grew up in a small town where everybody knew everybody. My mother died when I was 14. It was sudden, a car accident on a rainy Tuesday morning. She left for work and never came home. After that, it was just me and my father, a quiet man who loved me but never quite knew how to talk about feelings. So I learned to handle things on my own. I learned to read rooms. I learned to watch people carefully, because the people who hurt you most are usually the ones smiling the widest. That lesson would save my life years later, but I didn't know that yet. I met Carter on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. I was at a coffee shop, sitting in the corner with a book, and he walked in like he owned the room. Tall, well-dressed, easy smile, the kind of man who makes every head turn when he walks through a door. He spilled his coffee on my book. He was so genuinely embarrassed that I actually laughed, and he laughed too, and that was it, that was the whole beginning of everything. We talked for 3 hours that first day. He was charming and funny and surprisingly easy to be around. He came from money, old money, the kind that has a family name attached to a building somewhere, but he didn't wear it loudly. At least not then. We dated for 2 years. And in those 2 years, I loved him completely. But there were signs. There are always signs. I just chose to explain them away, the way you do when you love someone and the alternative is too painful to look at directly. The first sign was his mother, Diane. Diane was a tall, polished woman who spoke in a smooth voice and smiled with her mouth, but never her eyes. She was the kind of woman who made you feel like you were being evaluated every time she looked at you, like you were an item on a shelf, and she was deciding whether you were worth buying. From the first day Carter introduced us, Diane looked at me the way someone looks at a stain on a white carpet. Not with anger, with inconvenience. She was never openly rude to me. That was what made it so difficult to call out. She was polite, always polite, but her politeness had edges. She would compliment my dress while somehow making it sound like an insult. She would ask about my family and then change the subject before I could finish answering. She would invite me to family dinners and then seat me at the far end of the table where no one could hear me speak. Carter always said I was being too sensitive. And then there was Serena. Carter mentioned her once, early in our relationship, almost casually, the way you mention a restaurant you used to go to. My ex, Serena, we were together a long time, but it's done. I didn't ask too many questions. I trusted him. What I didn't know then, what I would only find out much later, was that Serena and Diane spoke on the phone almost every single day. That Diane had never accepted the breakup. That in Diane's mind, Serena was already her daughter-in-law, had been for years, would always be. I was never meant to be anything more than a temporary inconvenience. But the most painful part, the part that still sits heavy when I think about it, was Carter. Because Carter knew all of this. He knew his mother's plan. He knew Serena was still in the picture. He knew what was being built around me without my knowledge. And he said nothing. Because here is what I eventually found out about the man I almost married. Diane had given him an ultimatum. Quietly, privately, with the calm cruelty only a certain kind of mother is capable of. Marry Serena within a year, or lose your inheritance. The engagement to me, it was a delay. A way to buy himself time while he figured out what he wanted, while he tried to be brave enough to stand up to his mother. He never got there. He proposed to me at our favorite spot by the lake Golden Light, the words I had always wanted to hear, and I said yes with my whole heart. He proposed to me knowing he had already made a different decision. The engagement period should have been the happiest time of my life. Instead, it was a slow, quiet nightmare that I kept trying to convince myself was a dream. Diane took over the wedding planning the week after we announced our engagement. Not aggressively, smoothly. She offered to help, and before I could organize my own thoughts, she had already booked the venue, chosen the flowers, approved the catering, and selected the color scheme. None of it was what I would have chosen. But every time I tried to speak up, Carter would give me that look, that tired, slightly impatient look, and say, "She's just trying to help. Don't make this into something." So I stayed quiet, I kept the peace. I told myself it didn't matter, what mattered was the marriage, not the flowers. I didn't know yet that the flowers were the least of what had been arranged without me. What I didn't know, what Petra discovered 3 days before the wedding through a mutual friend, who finally grew a conscience, was this. Diane and Serena had been meeting every single week since my engagement was announced. They had planned the humiliation together, not as an impulsive reaction, as a performance. They had crafted every detail. Willow's family, my aunt, my cousins, the only people I had left in this world after my father passed, had been quietly given the wrong start time for the ceremony. Not by accident, on purpose, so that when I stood at that altar, I would be completely surrounded by Carter's people, by strangers who had already been told things about me that were not true. Because Serena, in the weeks before the wedding, had spread a quiet, devastating rumor through Carter's social circle, that I had been unfaithful, that Carter was too good for me, that the whole engagement was a mistake everyone could see but no one wanted to say out loud. By the time the wedding day arrived, half the room had already decided I was the villain of this story. And the dress. God, the dress. I had chosen my wedding dress 4 months before the wedding. It was simple and beautiful, and when I tried it on I had cried, the good kind of tears, the kind you don't expect. What I didn't know was that Diane had contacted the seamstress directly after my final fitting and had the dress quietly altered, taken in at the waist and chest, just enough to make me look uncomfortable, just enough to make me shift and strain on camera, just enough to make me look like I didn't quite fit in the dress, in the room, in the life. Carter knew about the dress alteration. He said nothing. When Petra came to my hotel room 3 days before the wedding and told me everything, sitting across from me with tears in her eyes and her hands shaking, I sat very still. She thought I was in shock. She kept saying my name. "Willow, Willow, say something." And I looked at her and said, "How much time do we have?" Because something had shifted inside me, something cold and clear and very, very focused. I was not going to cancel that wedding. I was not going to call Carter and scream. I was not going to confront Diane and give her the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. I was going to show up, in that dress, at that altar. And I was going to finish it, on my terms. I picked up my phone, and I called Carter's father, Grant. Now let me tell you about Grant, because this is where the story turns into something much bigger than a wedding. Grant was a quiet man, soft-spoken, background figure, always slightly overshadowed by Diane's personality. Most people forgot he was in the room. But Grant had been carrying something for a very long time. He had known for almost 3 years that Diane had been stealing from the family business. Not small amounts. Significant, structured, careful theft, funneled quietly into accounts that supported Serena's lifestyle. Because here was the secret nobody knew. Serena had been blackmailing Diane. Years ago, Diane had done something involving a business deal that had destroyed another family financially, something that could have sent her to prison if it ever came to light. Serena had found out, and instead of walking away, Serena had made herself comfortable. She had built her entire life on Diane's fear. Every luxury she had, every trip, every apartment paid for by Diane's desperation to keep her quiet. The relationship between them was not mother and chosen daughter. It was captor and prisoner. And Grant, quiet, overlooked Grant, had been watching it for years. He had tried to confront Diane once, and she had threatened to take everything, the house, the business, the reputation. So he had stayed silent. Until I called him. I told him what I knew. I told him what was planned for the wedding day, and I asked him one question. Are you willing to finally tell the truth? There was a long silence on the phone. And then he said, yes, I've been waiting for someone to ask. We spent 2 days, me, Petra, Grant, and a lawyer that Petra trusted, putting together a document. A signed, witnessed, legal document containing Grant's full statement. Every transaction, every transfer, every piece of evidence he had quietly gathered over 3 years. I had it folded inside my bouquet when I walked down that aisle. The morning of the wedding, I woke up before sunrise. I sat by the window of my hotel room and watched the city get light. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't sad. I was completely, almost eerily calm, the way the sky goes still before a serious storm. Petra helped me get dressed. The altered dress was tighter than it should have been. I felt it immediately. I took a slow breath. How do you feel? Petra asked. Ready, I said. I walked into that church, and every head turned. The room was full, packed with Carter's family, Carter's friends, Carter's social circle. People who had heard the rumors about me. People who were already whispering. I could feel it, that low, buzzing energy of a crowd that has already made up its mind. My side of the church was almost empty. My family, given the wrong time, was still 20 minutes away. I walked down that aisle alone. No music that I had chosen. The song playing was something Diane had selected last minute, a change I hadn't been informed about, another small cruelty, another carefully placed cut. I walked slowly, I kept my eyes forward, I held my bouquet with both hands. Carter stood at the altar. He looked pale. His hands were clasped tight in front of him. He wasn't looking at me the way a man looks at the woman he loves on their wedding day. He was looking at me the way a man looks at something he knows is about to go wrong. The officiant began. We were barely 2 minutes in, barely past the opening words, when Diane stood up. The room shifted immediately. That electric, charged shift when something unexpected happens in a crowd, and everyone's body responds before their mind catches up. Diane stood with her back straight and her chin up, and she spoke in a clear, carrying voice. The voice of a woman who had rehearsed this moment many times. She said that she had something to say before this wedding went any further. She said that everyone in this room who truly cared about her son deserved to know the truth. She said that Carter and Serena had found their way back to each other, and that anyone with eyes could see that this, gesturing at me, this was a mistake. And then she smiled. Not at me, at the room. Inviting them to agree with her. And they did. The laughter started near the back, a few people, then more, then the whole room catching like a flame through dry paper. Someone clapped. Someone near the front said something I couldn't fully hear, but the people around them laughed louder. And Serena stood up. She was dressed beautifully, of course she was. She had planned this entrance the way an actress plans her entrance. She stood and she looked at Carter, and she smiled the smile of a woman who believes she has already won. Carter looked at her. And he mouthed the words, right there, at his own altar, with me standing 3 feet away in a dress his mother had altered to humiliate me. He mouthed, I'm sorry. To her, not to me, to her. The room was still laughing. Someone near the back called out, she never belonged here anyway. More laughter. I stood at that altar, and I felt everything and nothing at the same time. I thought about my mother, about how she used to say, "Willow, the people who try to make you small are always the ones who are most afraid of how big you could be." I thought about every time I had stayed quiet to keep the peace, every time I had smiled through a dig from Diane, every time I had told myself I was overreacting, every time Carter had looked at me like I was being too much, when really, I was just finally being honest. I looked down at my bouquet. I reached in with steady hands, and I pulled out the folded document. The room was still noisy, still buzzing with laughter and whispers, as I walked to the microphone that had been set up for our vows. And then the room went quiet. Because a crying woman running out of a church is expected, a woman falling apart is expected, a woman begging and pleading and making a scene is expected. A woman walking calmly to the microphone, with a document in her hand, and nothing on her face but clarity. That is not expected. You could have heard a single breath in that room. I looked out at all of them. And then I looked directly at Diane. And I said the 3 words. "Read it, Diane." I held the document out toward her. She didn't move. So I began to read it myself, out loud, into the microphone, in the clearest voice I had ever used in my life. Grant's statement, every transaction, every transfer, every year of theft from the family business, and the reason behind it, Serena's blackmail, Serena's hold over Diane, the secret Diane had been paying to keep buried for years. I read every word. The laughter was gone. Serena's smile was gone. Diane had gone the color of paper. Carter gripped the altar rail with both hands. When I finished reading, I folded the document carefully. I placed it on the altar. I looked at Carter one final time. I said I came here today to marry a man I loved, but that man doesn't exist. He never did. And then I set my bouquet down next to the document, turned around, and walked out of that church. Not fast, not running. Walking, with my back straight and my head up and every step landing like it meant something. The room was completely silent. Not one person laughed. Petra was outside. Car running, window down, lawyer already on speakerphone. She had known me long enough to know I wouldn't be running. She had timed it right. I got in the car. Petra pulled out without a word. We were on the highway before anyone from inside that church had even moved. I cried exactly once, somewhere between the city and the open road. Hard, ugly crying, the kind that has been waiting a long time. Petra kept driving and didn't say anything, because she is the kind of friend who understands that some grief just needs to move through you. Then it was done. I wiped my face. I looked out the window. And I felt, underneath all the pain and exhaustion, something I had not felt in a very long time. Free. Carter called 41 times in the 3 days that followed. I know because I counted. Diane called 9 times. Numbers I didn't recognize called over and over. I turned my phone off and let the lawyer handle everything. What happened next unfolded faster than I expected. Grant's document was in the hands of the authorities within 48 hours. The family business accounts were frozen within the week. An investigation was opened. Serena, when she realized her leverage was gone and her name was attached to a blackmail case, left the city. Quietly, quickly, in the middle of the night like smoke disappearing. Her apartment emptied out. Her social media went dark. She simply vanished, taking with her all the confidence of a woman who had believed she was untouchable. She was very touchable. She had just never been touched before. Diane was removed from every board, every committee, every social circle she had spent decades building herself into. The woman who had curated her reputation so carefully, the woman who had looked at me like I was a stain, watched her own name become the thing people whispered about at dinner tables. Carter, the man who had stood at an altar and mouthed an apology to his ex while I stood 3 feet away, lost the inheritance he had quietly destroyed 2 years of my life to protect. Because the investigation made clear that he had known. And knowing and saying nothing in the eyes of the law is its own kind of guilt. He called me one final time, 6 weeks later. I answered, not because I wanted to hear him, but because I had one thing left to say. He started to speak, some version of sorry, some version of explanation, some version of the story that made him the complicated victim of his mother's ambition. I let him get 3 sentences in. And then I said, I gave you every chance to be the man I thought you were. You chose wrong. And I hung up. He never called again. 6 months later, I relocated to a new city. I used the money I was legally owed from the broken engagement, a clause in a contract that Diane's own lawyer had drawn up, ironically, to start a small business. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just mine. 1 year after that wedding day, I was sitting at a desk in an office with my name on the door, building something real. And then, on a Tuesday morning, out of nowhere, a letter arrived. Handwritten, no return address. I opened it. 4 words. You saved us all. It was signed Grant. I sat with that letter for a long time. And then I put it in my desk drawer. And I got back to work. People always ask me, what were you feeling when you walked out of that church? And I tell them the truth. I wasn't feeling victorious. I wasn't feeling vengeful. I wasn't even feeling particularly brave. I was feeling clear. For the first time in 2 years, I was seeing everything exactly as it was, not as I had hoped it would be, not through the soft, forgiving light of love, exactly as it was. And the 3 words, read it, Diane, they were not about revenge. They were about truth. I had spent 2 years making myself smaller to fit inside someone else's story, quieting myself, adjusting myself, convincing myself that my discomfort was sensitivity, that my instincts were insecurity, that my voice was too much. And at that altar, in that dress that had been made tighter on purpose, in that room that had been filled with people set up to laugh at me, standing across from a man who couldn't even look me in the eye, I finally stopped making myself smaller. And the room, that laughing, cruel, so certain room, went completely silent. That silence was the most powerful thing I have ever felt. Not because I had won something, because I had stopped losing myself. If this story touched something inside you, if you have ever stood in a room where people expected you to fall apart, and you had to decide in that one moment who you were going to be, share this video. Send it to someone who is in the middle of their own altar moment right now. Someone who is deciding whether to stay quiet or speak. Someone who needs to hear that calm is not weakness, that preparation is not coldness, that walking away with your head high is sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do. Subscribe to Willow, because every single week, we sit with stories like this one. Real, hard, human stories about what it takes to choose yourself when everything around you is telling you not to. And drop a comment below. I want to know. What would your 3 words have been? I read every single comment, every one. Thank you for being here. And I will see you in the next story.